This particular truck is 1998 Chevy K1500 Z71, has a 350 cubic inch 5.7 liter V8 mated to a 4L60E auto trans, and that, my friends, is what we're going to be doing today, is swapping out that factory auto trans and swapping in a factory 5-speed NV3500 transmission. So if you follow along, just know this is for entertainment purposes only. I am not liable for anything wrong you do to your truck and or if you hurt yourself. So again, entertainment purposes only. With that, I'll quit rambling. Let's go ahead and get started on swapping out the auto trans and putting in a factory 5-speed. Probably get it down. Before we add the third fun pedal here, we need to cut down this factory fat brake. We're going to mark it. We're going to cut it down to this size. That way we can get pedal pad this size on there. So we'll kind of be a little weird right there, but I think we'll be all right. After a lick of paint, here's where we're at. So that's the section we cut off. This is the big old pedal pad we no longer need. This is the one that was included with the clutch pedal that'll also work for the brake pedal. And then here supposedly is a new old stock version, which I ended up notching just a little bit out of this corner to give it some relief around this dip down portion. Now I will say, if you're craftier than myself, I'm sure you could find some good way of filling in those voids. Otherwise, it will have a little bit of movement where those gaps are. To add in the clutch pedal assembly, they sort of make it a little easier. The metal on the firewall is kind of dimpled in, so you have a template. On this truck though, I have what appears to be a cruise control module of some sort. I have a couple Phillips screws. We're going to remove that, get it out of the way. Two 15mm nuts. We're going to break loose, loosen up this master. We're going to try to get this power brake booster out of the way as well to give us some space, because we have two holes we got to drill, and of course a big old center hole to make room for the clutch master cylinder and of course the clutch bracket. Wish that was it to get this power brake booster out, but unfortunately that is not the case. We've got the master loosened up. We've got a hose, real simple. Just clamp this clip together and we'll go ahead and push it that way. We'll be able to get that rubber hose off. But more importantly, we need to get on the inside, kind of by the steering column. There's some carpet you can pull back. There's a little relief to it so you don't have to mess with the steering column. And then it exposes another 4 15mm bolts or nuts. 1, 2, 3, and the fourth one is hidden behind there. Most of these booster nuts I'm getting off with a swivel 15mm ratcheting wrench. Now for the top one, a little more complicated. Extension, and then all the way up in there I have a swivel going to a deep well 15mm socket. Before we go after this last nut, here are the 3 that we already removed. Now we're going to try to get the clip out somewhere up in there. Booster obviously is out. While it is quite ugly, I'm gonna clean it up, hit it with a lick of paint before we put it back in the vehicle when it comes time for reassembly. Now, as far as the clip, this is what I wasn't really able to get a good view of up in the steering column area. So basically you just get a screwdriver in here and then twist this open, and then you're able to work it off the shaft. But that is what it looks like kind of on the end here, at least on this 1998 Chevy model. I'm actually going to remove a couple more bolts. We have one right there, one right there. I'm not quite sure if there's another one underneath. Looks to be another one right there. I don't know the metric equivalent, but I have a 9/32 socket, and we're going to try to undo this because that'll help us and give us some space on the back side. Got the 3 bolts removed for this electrical box. 2 are longer, and then we have a shorter one, a little more difficult to get down to, which is right around in there. So I had to use 1/4 inch, some flex sockets, some extensions to get that out. What that did though is offer us the ability to loosen and remove this electrical box to get a little more freedom in here. So to make it easy for you, we already had this plastic piece scored with this foam on there, so you just tear it off. And now we have some room on the back side. Interior is protected a little bit, same as the firewall side, covering the electronics and the wires. Interesting, from the factory, this is center punched. The big hole seems pretty well centered, the other one's not so much. I'll have to go in there and center those as best as I can. But as far as what we'll be using to drill, my Ryobi right angle drill bit, we have a 3/8 inch drill bit and 2 inch. I don't have these centering bits in there just quite yet, but these are metal specific, and I got them from Amazon, and I will link them in the description. So far I got 1 hole drilled, and now I think I'm actually going to remove this fuse panel relay center. And how we're going to do that, it's pretty simple, just 3 8mm bolts. There's one more 8mm at the top of that fuse relay box deal, and then I was able to push it over. Now we have all the room in the world. I'm not going to go too much in detail as far as the holes and the generations of brackets, but just know there's 2 different generations of brackets. Use the link in the description. I talk more about them. This being a 98, it takes the Gen 2, what I call bracket. Holes are perfectly horizontal. The other version, a little more offset, but it should still be dimpled. What's a little bit different is this center hole. 2-inch hole saw. Hole's been cleaned up, primed, and I'll use in quotation color matched. But up top here, depending on what year you have, this truck being a 96 and newer has at least a stud, and then behind this wiring harness there's actually kind of like a riv nut. So there's a bolt that goes through there on this 96 and newer. The older versions, 95 to 88, use, I believe, 2 bolts. So we're ready to fish this thing through there, this clutch pedal assembly bracket. We'll worry about the pedal once everything is in there. I apologize for not really being able to get a real good view of this thing, bolting it in. I did leave that foam piece in here that is at the top. Again, on this 1998 version, we have a bolt here, and then there's a factory stud, so there is a nut. Both are 13 mils. Now if you have the older version, 88 to 95, more than likely it's 2 bolts, and then if it's a real early version, more than likely you don't have these provisions and you have to transfer over a bracket from a donor truck or kind of cobble something up together. But that is the bracket in place. The actual pedal itself, very simple to put in here, but we're going to go ahead and affix the 2 13 mil nuts at the firewall. This is just an older clutch master cylinder, line cut off. I'm just using this for a temporary mock-up, make sure everything works the way it should. And what is interesting about the 96 and up versions are the fact that they don't bolt in. The other versions use the actual offset studs. This is mainly relying on the bracket, some plastic, and twisting. So then we just have to turn it counterclockwise and it locks in place. We have the actual replacement clutch master cylinder in place. Just like before, you have it at the 2-3 o'clock position, and then you turn it counterclockwise and it locks into place. Incredibly solid in here. This, again, the real deal, so it has a replacement nylon line with it, filled with fluid, and then the way it was bent, it kind of just honestly fell right into place. I don't know if this is exactly where it needs to go, but it just seemed to make sense. We have a clip that was on the line. There was a hole here in a bracket that wasn't being used. Clip that in there. This line, or electrical harness, I had to manipulate a little bit, but there is another hole in a bracket that was empty with another clip on this line. Fell right into place, and then it bends down underneath the truck to match up with the slave cylinder. Here's the Gen 2 clutch pedal, put a NOS clutch pedal pad on here. What's really nice about the Gen 2 versions, they're spring loaded, so you simply just push this in to put it in place, or vice versa to remove it. The other versions, the first gens, have a big old bolt that goes in there, so you might have to put the entire assembly all up in there at once. One thing to mention though, on these Gen 2 versions, these little plastic bushings are complete unobtainium. I'm realizing the video, whenever I installed this, didn't film. So this is the clutch pedal bracket in place. We have the master coming through from the other side. And then it comes with a new clip that lines up with the stud up top there. Pretty simple. We just align it. A little easier said than done with one hand, and then just push it and we're good. By far one of my least favorite things to deal with is rusty exhaust, so I have 3 15mm bolts I'm going to try to knock off to get this backside of the cat out, and then we're going to move to the front of the Y pipe where it meets up with the exhaust manifolds. Well, off to a great start. Apparently didn't want to record, but I ended up snapping all 3 of these 3 50mm bolts. So not a good start. And in case you're wondering, I did soak these for quite a while in some penetrating oil, but apparently that wasn't enough. So not a good sign. But already I snapped a couple bolts. The ones I'm more concerned about though are at the end of the Y pipe down there where it meets in the manifold. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach for these manifold bolts. There's 3 14 mils. I'm going to actually start the vehicle up, let it warm the exhaust up. Not going to be ideal working underneath here with hot, but hopefully the heat will help with backing those bolts out. But beforehand, I'm going to knock this 13 mil loose. What that'll do is free up this kind of heat shield bracket to get access to the connector for the O2 sensor, because I'm simply never going to be able to get that out. Well, I got that 13 mil to back out a little bit, but then it was just spinning a stud. So unfortunately the stud let go of this little bracket, so I'm gonna have to get some kind of crafty method of getting pliers on there. But for now I kind of bent it out of the way to give me some space to undo this O2 sensor pigtail. Alright, so that is free, and this I'll have to come back to get this and just kind of do a nut and bolt. Yes. When in doubt, keep hammering smaller sockets onto it. Started with the 14, another one took a 13, this one took a 12. So we have another O2 sensor we need to unclip right here. I hate how they use these blue safety straps, because of course there's no room in here. I'm never going to be able to get that one off either. I'm going to fumble around here, try to get this one unclipped, and then we'll move on to the driver's side. Driver's side, we're starting out with a 15 mil, and we'll work our way down from there. All three of these driver's side ones didn't fight me, and they were easier to get to. That's a win. Here's the aftermath of removing that Y pipe, a bunch of broken exhaust studs, some nuts that surprisingly successfully came out, and then eventually I was able to get this little heat shield bracket that covers the O2 sensor connector. This is the section that was actually pressed in here. Whenever I was backing the nut out, it actually just spun this stud. It's just kind of pressed in here, so I ended up having to cut that out, but I was able to successfully remove that. As far as the Y pipe goes, here's that factory Y pipe. Very happy and surprised I was able to get the 3 nuts that connect this Y pipe to the exhaust manifolds. Unfortunately, I did snap the 3 studs on this side of the catalytic converter. I tried cutting them down, grinding, heating them up, PB blasting, hammering them out, and drilling to no avail, so I'm gonna have to phone a friend when it comes time for reassembly. But for now, we're gonna get back to the swap. This truck has the optional Z71 package to it, so it has this additional skid plate underneath the transfer case. So we have 4 15mm bolts, and on the top of the skid plate there's also 15mm nuts, so you got to get something up on top of the skid plate. With the skid plate removed, we now have access to this lower drain bolt. It's a 10mm hex. Fluid actually looks really good. Before we lower the transfer case, we need to go ahead and remove the drive shafts. The front one here is free spinning because the truck is in 2-wheel drive, but we have 4 11mm bolts at the front, another 4 where it goes into the transfer case. It's spinning, so it makes it a little easier. Now for the back, the truck is in park, so the drive shaft is locked. Right here, we're coming out of the transfer case is a slip yoke, and then another 4 11mm bolts at the tail end here where it goes into the rear diff. That secure that U-joint in place. A big point to mention is, even though this truck is in park, do yourself a solid, get some actual legitimate rubber blocks. Don't use a block of wood or some random rock you found to locate and stop this truck from rolling, because once you remove this drive shaft, this truck is going to wander whether the transmission is in park or not. And then mine has a great working rear parking brake system, so in addition to the blocks, I have the parking brake set. So now we are good to remove the drive shafts. We'll probably lose a bit more fluid, so I got a drain pan ready. This part will vary depending on what transfer case you have. This truck has the shift on demand, the electric shift, the NP243 transfer case. I believe that's a vehicle speed sensor we'll need to unhook. And then we have this actuator of sorts, so we need to unplug that. And while we're in here, we'll go ahead and unplug some of these other connectors. For comparison, here's the manual shift NP241. So if this is the version you have a clip that needs to undo for the shift linkage, but otherwise the sensors, at least this one is in the same spot, and there is a sensor right there. I'm just going to take out this one 50mm bolt and hopefully remove this bracket with the wiring harness. Not sure how this shifter linkage comes off for the moment, so I'm just going to undo this 15mm nut. There's a little 8mm bolt up here holding in a harness and looks like a breather tube. Next up, we're going to drain the fluid in this 4L60E auto trans. We're going to start by removing this heat shield. There's two 10mm bolts and then a whole bunch of 13 mils that hold in this pan. We're not going to remove it completely, or at least that's the thought process. I'm hoping to kind of lower it, tip it, and then have it pour into a drain pan. Pan is back on the transmission. We have it supported with a floor jack. What we're gonna do right now is remove the two 15mm bolts up top here that go into the transmission. This is the transmission mount, and then two more 15mm nuts. Not those bolts, these ones around here. Alright, you know what? I'm gonna remove that. Got four 18mm bolts, two on each side, but you gotta get something on the back side, also an 18mm, or in my case, just an adjustable wrench to pull the nuts from the back side. Obviously, with that cross member removed, we have a lot of real estate here to get access to these six 15mm bolts. Now, the real MVP is this 3/8 Craftsman ratchet that is flexible. I will link it in the description in case you're interested. But look how perfect it is in this scenario. Floor jack is removed, trans jack is in place in its proper home underneath the auto trans. Quick sidebar, just want to appreciate the person who really gooped all this grease on here, because honestly, this stuff is in great shape. As far as the transmission removal goes, we have some 10mm bolts to to remove the shield so we get access to the torque converter, remove those bolts, and then also two 15mm bolts to remove the starter. Sorry, you're kind of in my way. I had to adjust the camera. Yeah, if you guessed 15 mil for the support brackets, at least the nuts on the end, you were correct. So the support brackets that go to the trans go, this is on the passenger side, and then the driver side. Oil filter and diff for reference. I'm not gonna lie, these little support brackets, pain in the butt. Two 18mm wrenches to get these things out. God, what an awful design. Got it. Now we have access. Torque converter bolts. Here's my method for loosening up the four 15mm torque converter bolts. I have a breaker bar with the pry bar jammed in here, and then once you break it loose, then what I've been doing is switching to a 15mm ratcheting wrench. I did just realize there's a metal access hole. You can simply, once this back cover is out, stick your finger here and pop this out, so that gives you a better way to lock in the flex plate as you break loose the torque converter bolts. Transmission lines going into the actual transmission are 19mm. That bolt up there appears to be holding up a fuel line bracket to the bell housing. It's actually a 14 mil, but I'm able to get to it with a very long extension. So it's actually just a 14mm nut, and there's a stud with a 15mm bolt on there. Now we're gonna knock that loose. Here's a better view of what's left at the top of the transmission here. That's what we just removed over there. We have another 14 mil to get this bracket off, and then likely a 15mm stud behind there. And then on the passenger side, same kind of situation. We have 14mm, and then underneath that, once that is loosened, it's like a heat shield that the grounding straps and some other electrical stuff goes through. But once these two 14 mils are loose, the nuts are off, then we got two 15mm studs behind there. So 3 more to go, and the bell housing bolt should be all freed up. Alright, should be the last 15. Since we're going to a manual transmission, we no longer need the automatic cooler lines. So we have two fittings going into the radiator. I have a 16mm wrench. We're going to knock these loose, and then we're going to block these off when we're done. Whoops. So the trans lines run along the passenger side of the oil pan, and they're held in with this bracket. I think I'm just gonna try to push up, get them out of that bracket. Now I should be able to finagle these things out of here. I was able to simply remove one of the lines that goes from the transmission directly up and goes to the radiator. Now this other line is a lot more difficult, I'm now realizing. So there's this plastic panel. I removed two 15mm bolts. There's another two I left in here on either side. Lets it swing down. I was able to chase this line further, and then there was actually a plastic panel right here that's held in with three 10mm bolts. So I believe like 1, 2, 3, somewhere in there. But then I started following the lines, and then I quickly realized this thing has a oil cooler, which led me to removing the grill. So if you've never removed one of these grills, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 small little screws. Now I know I'm mixing metric and standard in this video, but I'm using what I have. So a 9/32 was able to remove these for the grill, and then there's 4 of these Phillips screws that hold in these lights on both sides. Remove that, and then undid the bulbs, quick little twist, and then there's a couple clips or tabs that you have to lift up to release the bottom of this grill, and then you're able to remove it. So now what that did was expose this oil cooler. I no longer need it because the automatic transmission is going away. So we have a couple bolts we're going to remove and some other lines we're going to remove and chase to see where else they go. We're going to undo 6 10mm bolts. Got some shop towels on standby. We're gonna crack these lines loose. We have a 19mm wrench. Which I guess these have quick connects. Just got a hook tool to remove the little snap ring. This is what I definitely could have done on the transmission, but I went the hard way. Totally optional, but what I am choosing to do is block off my original spots on the radiator where the automatic transmission lines go into. Now I've tried a bunch of different fittings. It seems like a lot of these trucks use a much smaller fitting, possibly due to running an aftermarket radiator and them coming with this adapter. But on my case, that doesn't work. I basically pulled this from the junkyard just to get an idea on size. So mine is a larger size fitting. Initially I tried this bubble flare version. The thread seemed decent, but being bubble flared, it's just too long of a nose to thread in there. Now I also tried NPT thread, National Pipe Taper thread, I think like 3/8. But what I came up with was at Napa, they have this Weatherhead by Danfoss. It's an inverted flare connector or inverted flare plug, I guess. I don't know the thread pitch offhand. Hopefully I'll be able to link it in the description. But the part number is WH131X6. Go to your local Napa and they should be able to hook you up. So this threads in beautifully. Gonna add some pipe tape to this and then tighten it down. We of course have 2 of them, one for the top, one for the bottom, and we don't have to worry about any residual transmission fluid leaking out of this side of the radiator. Got 6 14mm bolts to remove this flex plate. We're almost to the point where we're completely disassembled and it's just reassembly from this point here and out. We got to do the pilot bearing. We got to cut the hole. Have a nice dimple here, but we're going to pull the interior, get the carpet out there, and cut it from the top down. But I recommend do a bunch of while you're in there. So my rear main appears to be in really great shape. This engine only has 74,000 miles on it, but I did order a rear main just in case. Another while you're in there, my oil pan gasket clearly leaking pretty bad, so I'm going to change that out. And then where the oil filter screws into the housing, I have an O-ring gasket kit of some sort, so another while you're in there. Now I'm on to the point where I'm going to actually pull this carpet. You can take a chance, cut that hole with the carpet in place, but for me personally, I want to take out this interior just to see what is kind of lurking from underneath. I think for the most part I got this thing cleaned after I purchased it, but I do want to pull all of this out. The two seats, center console, back plastic, seatbelt trim, door sill trim, and peel up this carpet to get a better access of the dimple where we need to cut, and then that'll give us a template where we need to take a razor blade and cut the carpet. So we have various bolts. I believe 4 bolts per seat on this. Obviously this depends if you have a bench seat, if you have the 60-40 split seat, or like the buckets in the console version like this. But we have some more bolts that hold in this plastic tray. I have to take out the jack, tire iron, things like that, and I have to figure out how to pull out that center console. Once you lift up the center console piece, there's 2 10 mils in the front, and then I think the back is just held underneath that clip. Got one 13mm bolt that holds this tray in. One of the worst things about this was this bolt right here, screwed in like that. I actually had to cut this off so I could get a socket on this to undo it. It was a 9mm. Using any of my wrenches, including a specialized offset one, was just stripping it for whatever reason. So I ended up taking a Dremel, cutting this down, and then I was able to get a 9mm socket on here and back this out. But man, that was a pain. Now we're able to undo this and get the seat out. Got T50 Torx for the seat belt assembly. Not sure what a Torx looks like. Kind of like a star, but not. Thing was in there. Then for this bolt, I believe it's an 18. I can't find my 18 deep mount, so I'm gonna try a 19 and hopefully I don't round that off. In case you're wondering why I'm going this way, passenger side door is up against the garage, so not enough room to get it out that side, so I had to go the hard way. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about stripping out these 3 Phillips screws. Here's what we left with. It's really cool to see that original not faded blue. Obviously there's some cleanup to do. It's kind of impressive how stuff gets up underneath this carpet. But what's really neat is that they have the sockets for for the manual shifter for the 4-wheel drive, 2-wheel drive selector. So if I had that option, there would obviously be a hole here, the shift lever going through, but kind of cool that it still had the pigtails just tucked up underneath the carpet. But they make it relatively simple where we need to cut this section out to put the fun stick. I have where I want to cut the hole marked out. So this entire raised portion, sort of a template, but don't cut out the entire thing. What I ended up doing to mark it, obviously I put down some painter's tape. This is an original inner boot. You can't even find these anymore. Most people don't even run them after they crumble. That's the part number. It's reversed for whatever reason. But basically I kind of line this up. The outer edge lines up with the raised portion. So I kind of just set this in place. I took the trim ring, set it over top, lined up these holes as best as possible. This being ripped, this kind of a little bit wonky. Line that up, mark the outside of it, got that out of the way, set this back in place with it being lined up on the outside. Then I mark the inside. That way once we cut this inner section, there's plenty of metal for this trim ring to mount to. So if you were to cut out this entire raised section, basically the entire boot and this piece would fall down through the floor, and that's not what you need. So even though they make it nice, dimpled and raised for you, don't cut out the entire thing. So I'm going to drill a starter hole and then use my jigsaw with the metal blade to slowly go around. Definitely a bunch of different ways to go about it, but I want to do the route that has the least amount of sparks. Well, my friends, I think we have a hole. I still have some deburring and obviously some cleaning up to do here, but overall I'm very pleased with the cutout of this hole. So starting out with a drill bit and then using a jigsaw with the metal blade worked out beautifully. I think it was a much cleaner route, although it did create quite a bit of metal dust. Definitely didn't make a lot of sparks, which was good. I will say this looks offset, but I mainly think that's because of the option. If you have a manual lever to get this thing into 2 or 4-wheel drive, you have a manual transfer case, but lining this inner boot up is perfect. So to mount this, there's actually 4 screws. You use the inner holes to mount this. Then you have the accordion style, the actual shift boot, that upper one that you see, and then this trim ring goes on the bottom of that. So notice how this covers those 4 inner bolts, and then to mount this, there's the 4 outer screws. But I'm gonna wait until we actually have the transmission in here so I know 100% sure this is where it needs to be. Ended up pulling out the automatic transmission shifter cable. This grommet popped right out, fish this right out. I'm gonna have to figure out best course of action to patch that hole up, but tracing this goes to the steering column, and what we need to do is disconnect it from right here. Pretty simple, ball and socket, shove a screwdriver in there, loosens that up, and now we have this cable. That connector I wasn't able to get out in one piece when I was loosening it up. Ended up breaking. That's okay. To fill the void where the automatic shifter cable went through, I'm going to reuse the original grommet. I ended up just squirting in a bunch of RTV sealant, letting this thing dry overnight, and we're just going to pop it back into place. Oh, hey! I didn't see you there. This is me from the future taking a quick pause on this how-to video to say thank you for making it this far, and I hope to see you at the end of it. I did want to take a quick second to mention how this video is not sponsored by anybody except myself. So if you like this kind of video, please give it a thumbs up at a minimum. Consider subscribing, and if you feel so inclined to do so, do a super thanks at the bottom right of the video, and you can send $200 to $500. That keeps the motivation going for this. Because again, I am a very small YouTube channel. I rely heavily on my viewers to drive this passion. So no matter what, as long as I'm physically able to, I always intend to work on things. It's just a bit of a bear sometimes to film while you are working. And of course, editing the videos a lot of times takes longer than the actual project itself. Again, thank you for making it this far, and I hope to see you at the end of it. So at this point, I already have the pilot bushing in place. All I ended up doing was taking a 19mm deep well socket I had. It was the perfect size, outer diameter as the pilot bushing, and I just slowly tapped it in evenly. And then now we have the little spacer. We have a 9/16 socket. We're gonna go ahead and put the 6 bolts in. We're gonna use some red Loctite and then torque them down to 65 foot-pounds. Only goes on one way. In my case, the dowel is at the 6 o'clock position. Pressure plate bolts are in place. Double check the torque specs. What I found online was 35 foot-pounds. Did a star pattern. Went around one full circle just to make sure everything was good. And this, while it is tight, it does remove. Whew, there it is. So we are now good to install the NV3500 5-speed trans. Before the transfer case goes back into the truck, there's one big point of mention. This is the NP243 that came out of the truck. It is the automatic or push button selection for 4-wheel drive model. This is an NP241 with the manual selection, so it has the additional floor shifter that selects it into 2 or 4-wheel drive. Now, depending on what you have, determines the spline count. So mine being a 4L60E automatic truck, it has a 27 spline on the input shaft. So this is the side that bolts into the back side of the transmission. This came out of the 5-speed, the factory truck with the NV3500 5-speed. This has a 32 spline. So I need to swap these over. You may be able to do away with this if your truck is the 2500 or higher, I guess 1-ton 3500. If you had the 4L80E, that should already have a 32 spline, and you don't need to go about any of this with swapping the input shafts. It's just simply if you have a 4L60E and you're going to a 5-speed, whether it be the NV3500 or the NV4500, you're gonna have to swap the transfer case, or at least find a transfer case with a 32 spline input shaft. This is the original transfer case that came with the 5-speed transmission, and this is the planetary gear set with the 32 spline input shaft that we need. There it is. Now we just need to swap this into the original transfer case that came with the truck. Here's the transfer case tore apart that came with the truck with the automatic switch or selector. So now that I have the planetary out, this is literally the only thing we need. And my planetary that came in this one has half the miles, 70-some thousand miles. The other one has around 150,000 miles. So literally, I'm just swapping this section with a 32 spline into my original planetary here. And there's a gazillion snap rings. I'm going to reseal it and put it all back together with new fluid. But you can honestly swap the entire thing. I just figured since my planetary, this section here, has half the miles, I might as well just swap over the only thing I need. And quick comparison, you can see this outside edge here. This is the larger 32 spline that I'm putting in. This is the original. See how it has a thicker ring to it? 27 spline. So that's the whole reason why we're swapping everything. So this original transfer case can finally bolt up to the NV3500 manual trans. Got the automatic harness, the original one to the truck, kind of in place to where I'm going to be plugging it in. So some of this stuff to be determined what I need to do. These go to the park neutral safety switch. This one, the 4L60E. This one, the driver's side upstream O2 sensor. Following along, there's a bunch of just weird connectors kind of looped together that I got to figure out exactly what I need to do. But for starters, I'm going to re-plug in all the stuff to this original transfer case. And this passenger side downstream sensor is the longest run of the harness. That goes into these clips. This, I think, is the passenger downstream O2 sensor. And then there is a breather line we need to re-plug in up at the top here. Just like that. There's a bracket that goes into the side of the transmission. Need to find the bolt for that. And then this is different, and we don't have a plug for this just quite yet, but this will be how we get the reverse lights to turn on with this sensor. For at least the NP241 it takes a massive hex. It's a 17 mil. When I was putting the trans in, I ended up taking off this top shifter piece beforehand. That way it gave me a little more room to finagle this thing in. So it just takes 4 bolts to remove. Now my original ones are real rusty and crusty, so now that I'm putting it back together, I'm replacing them. These are M6 by 1.0, and I think they are 30 mil in length. So now, instead of using the plug at the bottom to fill it up, this is a much better solution. So it takes about 2 quarts. We'll fill it up, and we're using synchro mesh. Before you bolt up the Y pipe, I highly suggest, if you're lucky like myself to retain the original studs in this exhaust manifold, get yourself a thread chaser and run it on these studs. Now, oftentimes these things get rusty and crusty. The original nuts that went on these studs were completely withered away. This was one of the better ones, and there's not much material here, but at least enough to where I could take it to my local hardware store and match up the threads to 3/8 by 16. But I believe GMT400s also used M10 by 1.5. So if you have a remaining original nut, figure out the thread pitch size. Go on Amazon. I'll link the 2 different sizes of thread chasing tools. Again, mine was 3/8 by 16. Run it on the stud, and that cleans up these threads perfectly. And I picked up a pack of 3/8 by 16 flange nuts, and now I'm good to bolt everything back together, and I have nice clean threads for these new nuts to go onto. And yes, I did pull out the original gasket. That way it gave me plenty of room to thread all the way up to this flange of the exhaust manifold, and then I ended up ordering 2 new exhaust manifold gaskets. And now we're good to put the Y pipe back in place. Alright, since mine has the dual exhaust, I guess, that goes into the muffler, then single exit, factory exhaust, I'm using a 315/75 Walker exhaust gasket. Looks like this. For the original cover, for that O2 sensor connector, this is it. Sprayed a little rust converter and some paint on top of it. Now, if you remember, I had an issue with the original stud spinning, so I put a M8 riv nut in here. If you're not sure what a riv nut is, basically it's just a thread insert. So I have a 13mm bolt that I'll be able to put on the opposite side. It'll sit something like that. 13mm bolt on the other side of the frame, just like it would have been from the factory. The beauty of a thread insert is that you don't need a wrench on the backside. My least favorite part about this entire conversion is the simple fact that you have to cut a hole in the floor, cut the carpet to match it. Easier said than done. Whenever I was templating everything out, I accidentally shifted the trans boot too far forward, cut too much of the carpet here, but I think I can cheat it. And whenever I use the trim ring to bolt this down, I can pull the carpet back a little bit and it'll hide some of that. But for starters, we have this crumbling isolator. I'm trying to find a replacement, but a lot of times this is just pretty much withered away, and that's why it looks like this. But it's just an additional isolator to help with noise, to help with any airflow, things like that. Exhaust gases sneak up through the floor in the trans tunnel. And we have the shift boot, and lastly the trim ring. The actual shift boot gets mounted with 4 screws on the inside, and then this trim ring gets screwed, again, the 4 outside. So a total of 8 screws. We have these original chrome ones. Those are the 4 corners, and then the 4 inners are these factory black screws, but they're really nothing too fancy, just some probably like 1-inch Phillips screws. Interior is now being put back together. The actual shift knob, I have it loose. I want to wait till I get the seat in there, have that at the good angle that I want it at before I cinch down the bolt that tightens it. Now this gray tray that holds the jack and affiliated spare tire stuff, that's in place, and then I set down this long section, and obviously this will be different if you have an extended cab, but I ended up pulling another one of these out of the junkyard. What an absolute pain. Lobbed up a bunch of anti-seize. We'll go ahead, put this in place, and then to tighten it down, because this is like an older version, has a bit of a tip to it, you can take an E8 external Torx socket and just kind of tighten it from the top. Now that we have a fun stick, we can get rid of this little wiggly stick. And to do that, we're going to remove the clamshell trim piece that surrounds the steering column. And I have one that I'm going to replace it with from the manual donor truck, and simply it doesn't have a hole right there where the automatic wiggly stick pops out of. That went flying off, but this simply just pulls out. The T25 Torx somewhere up underneath here. Now we have an E5 external Torx socket. So you can simply remove the lever with this Torx, remove that. You can remove the lever, but I'm going to try to remove this complete mechanism. So there's a Torx screw there and there, likely another one maybe right there underneath. But I'm going to try to remove the complete assembly of this. T30 Torx. See how far we get. have another E5 Torx right there that we're gonna have to remove. We're gonna go ahead, put the little tilt lever back in place. That way we can tilt this down and try to get this little clamshell piece out once we remove that other E5. Before we're able to get this off, it is trapped by the ignition lock cylinder. So what we're gonna do is take a hook tool. There's a small hole right there. We're gonna have to get the key at the correct orientation. It might be in the run position, might be in the start position. I did pull off the battery cable, so this thing does not have any power, but we're gonna push down on the hook tool and turn the ignition, see if we can pop this thing out. Underneath, further down in the steering column, I am disconnecting this sensor right here. So this was actually right in there. I just pried it away, popped off, ball and socket real easy. This connector was kind of a bear. There was a green tab on the back I had to pull out, and then push in this tab and was able to get it out from the back side. And then on the top, just got a screwdriver in here and was able to pop out this cable. Now we just finagle this thing out somehow and see if this thing starts without this whole mechanism in here. Here's that automatic shifter column assembly that we just removed. This is the sensor that we unplugged. I did not bypass it, I simply just unplugged it, and I have the pigtail hanging on the steering column. But this is a shift interlock sensor, and this is what allows you to start an automatic vehicle with the foot on the brake. If it didn't start with your foot on the brake, could be, say, like a brake switch, or potentially this, or even if it does start and the vehicle's running, it won't allow you to get out of park and to select it into, say, drive. More than likely this is the sensor. So all of this is not used for the manual, so we simply removed it. Still does the steering wheel lock. That's good. Okay. Let's see if it starts. We're going to go a step further. Because I'm OCD, I want to get rid of all of this for the automatic transmission. We no longer need the apply brake to shift from park. So this is going to go. I have a faceplate from the donor truck that was the manual. So we're going to go ahead and pull off this trim surround, get access to the instrument cluster, pull that out, and swap in the manual faceplate to this original low mile cluster. Now we have 4 7mm screws we need to remove. Definitely nerve-wracking to say the least, disassembling this thing, especially a good working cluster. So basically I'm going to swap all of this over from my original automatic cluster to the faceplate of this manual specific cluster. A very small T7 Torx. Now we have a T10 for the trip and the odometer. Looking closer, you actually don't need to swap over this plastic piece. It is automatic specific. That way it isolates the lights as you select the different gears. So as you're doing this, you just primarily need to swap over the faceplate, the odometer, the stepper motors if you so choose. But again, you don't need to swap over this little plastic piece. Thing I noticed on the manual cluster that mine does not have, because of course this was the original automatic one, is the up shift light. So transferring this bulb from the original manual cluster. Now ready to put it back in the truck. Cluster is back in-ish, minus this trim panel. What I'm gonna do is drive the vehicle around for a couple days, just make sure everything seems normal. Because I'm not quite sure how much fuel is in there, and that doesn't seem right, 3/4. So I'm gonna fill it totally full and then see where that needle's at and pull off this plastic plexiglass if need be to pull the needle off and adjust. But as far as testing this, everything appears to be working. So right now it's pretty cool. It does have around 14-15 volts. Oil pressure, that seems pretty normal for this. Fuel, again, not totally sure. The tach does work. And then I just need to drive it to see if the speedo works. Brake light went off. And can't really go far, but we'll see if the speedo moves. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay. Now we're ready to reattach the lower clamshell trim piece for this column. I already reattached the E5 external Torx up top there. I have one more that needs to go right there. And then we have two T25 Torx screws like this. That'll go in the lower section right there and right there. Now if you notice, whenever this was initially removed, this piece broke off. It should actually look identical to this, but I simply took some sandpaper, flattened that out, glued a brass washer to it, just kind of what I had that was like the perfect size, and that should hold beautifully. Whenever you put this back into place, make sure you get the back on both sides hooked in to up top here. And lastly, the little tilt lever, if you have this feature. I'll be honest, I'm a younger dude, but some of the older folk that are watching this will greatly appreciate this. Haynes, Chilton, whatever the case may be, immerse yourself in an actual physical book, or I guess technically you can find this electronically, but the wiring diagrams, however you do it, immerse yourself in it to figure out exactly, depending on your year, what you need to do. Now, I did get from the donor truck the complete transmission harness for the NV3500, but pretty much should be the same for a 4500. Mainly, I needed this plug that clips into the backup lamp sensor. Back underneath the truck, this is that backup lamp sensor. I did end up replacing it for this NV3500, and temporarily I still have this selector switch, whatever you want to call it, plugged in. I will be bypassing that because I feel like that's one more failure point, but this is the specific plug we need to tap into to get the reverse lights working. So I'm sure the colors vary between years, but we have a pink and a light green. We have C, if you're looking at the diagram for the ignition, and the light green is F for backup lamp. And again, there's two light greens at least on this 1998, so be very cautious of which one you're tapping into. Now I'm going to make this harness kind of dual purpose, so instead of just lobbing off this connector, I'm going to tap in a little further back. So if I ever wanted to go back to an automatic, I am retaining these plugs like such and tap into that, and eventually we're going to be capping this off, but that gives you an idea of what needs done to get your reverse lights working. Here's a test. Key in the ignition, not in reverse. Reverse lights obviously should not be on. In reverse, and voila! Perfect. Works like a charm. So if you want to get this whole ordeal to work without having this neutral park safety switch, whatever you want to call it, plugged in and tucked away, literally all you have to do is bridge the purple and the purple, at least on this 1998. So looking at this specific connector, which goes to this park neutral safety switch, whatever you want to call it, focus in on this connector. This is considered G, this is considered E. G is the park neutral safety signal, E is a starter signal. So literally all you have to do is bridge this to this and it will start. Now if you want to get this to work as close to OEM as possible, basically you're doing the same, but instead of bridging it, you'll take one of these pins and go all the way up to the clutch safety switch, and then this other pin, same thing, to the clutch safety switch. Now up underneath the dash here, this clutch safety switch, two of these wires we're not going to worry about just quite yet. Those go to the cruise control module. It'll disengage cruise control as soon as you depress the clutch. With the clutch safety switch oriented just like this, the purple and white, this wire right here, temporarily have it in place. This goes to that neutral safety switch, that connector, and it goes to E. And then this one right here, which is the top left in this orientation, goes to G on that park neutral safety switch connector. So before we make this permanent, obviously you want to test this thing. So clutch is not depressed, truck is in neutral, nothing happens. Now depress the clutch, turn the key, there you go, release the clutch, beautiful. Now we just need to make this clutch safety switch wiring permanent. Here's where we're currently at with the wiring. Here's the electrical pigtail that goes into this clutch switch. Purple wire, obviously there's more than one, but purple wire for B is staying in the vehicle. That's what this wire is. Need to tap into the brake light switch somewhere up in here. Pins A, C, and D, these three wires I have bundled together. I have them routed through this block, and then I put a hole in the firewall with the grommet, and then those three wires for A, C, and D going from the interior here into the engine bay. You're not going to be able to really see where it's coming through the firewall, but the wire that has the casing on it, that is one that I added, and that is coming up to this cruise control module right here. If you have cruise control, real simple to undo the pigtail. And pin D on that clutch pedal switch that comes through the firewall gets connected to D on this plug, and it's pretty simple how they do it. So D in this case is purple, so I literally just tapped into it. So coming from the clutch safety switch, I teed into this, I'm going to resheath it, and then C and A from the clutch safety switch going through the firewall, those two wires are going down. You can kind of see them right there, and those will get connected to that park neutral safety switch. Last bit of wiring that we're going to tackle is from the clutch safety switch, that electrical pigtail B, going to the stop or the brake lamp switch. So this is it, kind of a bear to remove up in the dash on the brake pedal assembly there. Fortunately, it is a nice sub harness, so you can undo it from here. I just ended up removing the complete brake switch assembly, and here's the pigtail that we're focusing on, and more importantly, C, this purple wire, and this is a trigger that goes to the PCM. So we're going to be connecting the clutch pigtail B to this purple C wire, putting it back in, and hopefully that means whenever we have cruise control on, we press the clutch, it'll disable cruise control just like it would with the brake pedal pressed. This purple wire is now teed into this brake lamp stop sub harness, and we're good to put it all back in place. Now an extra step I'm taking is to cap off the original 4L60E auto trans harness that's left underneath the truck. I doubt I'll ever do it, but if the day were to come I wanted to swap this back to an automatic transmission, well, the plugs are there. I'll just have to remove the caps. So to make the caps, what I ended up doing was taking an old park neutral safety switch, cut off the pigtails, de-pin them. They pretty much just fell apart from whenever I cut this. Squeezed a bunch of RTV after grinding these as flat as possible, that's rock solid, and put some dielectric grease inside of there to further prevent moisture from getting in there. So that takes care of the park neutral safety switch side of things. Now, possibly more important is the main plug that goes directly into the 4L60E, and this is that plug. So I ended up going to the junkyard, I pulled the bottom pan underneath here, and I simply de-pinned the connector, ground it as best as possible to get some of the extra stuff off of it, squeezed a bunch of RTV in the base of it, and then again put some dielectric grease. So now these three plugs can clip into the bottom of the truck to prevent moisture and elements from getting in there and causing issues in the wiring harness. And here of course is the factory harness underneath the truck. Just to test drive it, I took these out of the way, but of course this is something that you don't want rainwater as you're driving on a wet road to splash up in and cause issues. So here is one plug. Just got to find the direction this needs to go. So that needs pushed on there a bit more, but for one-handed that's good. You get the idea what we're doing. This is the smaller one, and then the bigger one like that. We'll make sure these are fully on there, tuck them out of the way, zip tie them for good measure. Now we're ready for the front drive shaft and the U-joint clamps or caps, whatever you want to call them. 11 mils on the end of these. Front drive shaft is bolted in place, pretty simple. With this thing in two-wheel drive, it's easily maneuverable. Just kind of spin it to get access to the four 11mm bolts on either side of the drive shaft. And now, if you have the Z71 package, you have to reattach the skid plate, and that takes four 15mm bolts and nuts. And that protects the transfer case. Truck has been relatively carefree the past 50 miles of test driving. Now, one thing that I have run into an issue is with the clutch safety switch when it comes to disengaging cruise control. Unfortunately, whenever you press the clutch in with cruise control on, it just wants to rev up to the moon because of course you have the clutch pushed in. It doesn't disengage. Looking closer, I think I may have found the issue, and what I'm doing is accidentally sending mixed signals to the cruise control module. Story of my life. Now, this originally goes directly from the brake pedal switch to the disengage input of the cruise control module. Right now I have it teed, so it's thinking that it's getting signals from both the automatic routing and the manual routing. I think simply all I need to do is do away with this section. So I actually disconnected, this is that sub harness that I teed into, and I'm actually just going to pull out this purple wire. That way I'm not cutting anything. I can do some testing, plugging it back in and seeing if this works for my cruise control and pressing the clutch and stopping the cruise control safely. Cruise control set, tap on the brake, and cruise control shuts off. We're slowing down. Go ahead, bring it back up to speed. Set the cruise control. engages the cruise control. Just got my engine computer back from Sinister Performance. There's a couple different companies out there that you can ship this to, or maybe even remotely do it if you have the proper hookups. But for me, Sinister Performance was the best turnaround time and the best price. So I just got this thing back. It's 40 degrees, windy and rainy, but I'm super excited to get this truck back up and running with no check engine lights. In case you're wondering, I'm one of these blue guys short temporarily because unfortunately I dropped it and it's way down in there somewhere. Oh, you can kind of see it right there. So I got to figure out how to fish it out, and then this will be fully installed. Got it. Back in the truck. First start since swapping that PCM. Fires up, no problems there. That's a good sign. Right from the beginning, no check engine lights. So obviously time will tell after driving this thing for a little bit, see if any check engine lights come back, but that's already a good sign. That, my friends, is going to wrap it up on the auto to manual swap for this 1998 K1500 OBS Chevy GMT400 platform vehicle, 1988 to 1998, and then the heavier duty stuff trickling into the early 2000s. Talking Yukons, Tahoes, Suburbans, Cs, Ks, 15, 25, 3500, all within that GMT400 umbrella. This particular auto to manual swap video should help you in one way, shape, or form. I highly suggest use the link in the description, not only for the parts and the tools that I use, but also to watch a clutch pedal difference video that I did about a year ago, so that way you know exactly what style clutch pedal you need before you even start. There will be some specific differences depending on what year. The wiring, colors, gauges may change. Also, if you have a two-wheel drive, it's definitely going to be a lot simpler. You don't have to fiddle around with the transfer case and swapping planetaries. None of that nonsense. You just take out your drive shaft, put the new 5-speed in, and put your factory drive shaft in. So if this video helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. I have a ton of videos out there, more to come in the future. And if you feel so inclined to, it would absolutely make my day. Send a super thanks my way. A couple bucks goes a long way for a YouTuber like myself who's very small and doesn't have any sponsors. So just a couple bucks can get me a cup of coffee to inject some caffeine to give me the motivation to keep this thing going. I appreciate you making it this far in the video, and I hope to see you on the next one.